The Death Korps of Krieg are considered by many to be the most 40K of 40K things. They're unrelenting, merciless, emotionless. They're the most inhuman of humanities. Soldiers for the Guardsmen of Krieg, all their humanity has been stripped away long before they see active service beyond their homeworld. Thus, the general impression other Imperial Guard regiments have of those who hail from Krieg is that a fearless, unrelenting, uncaring machines of war, for whom not many victory, but fulfilling their objectives comes at any cost, and that cost, of course, being generally their lives. The same could be said, of course, for any Guard regiment. Yet, unlike other Guard regiments, who, unless the objective is truly critical, may at some point consider a tactical retreat or consolidation of their positions, for the Guardsmen of Krieg, no cost is too high, no ground should be given, no retreat, no surrender, no thought to the cost paid in human lives. This mentality is embedded within the soldiers of Krieg, often to a point where their sacrifice becomes seemingly and often literally counterproductive in the eyes of others. Whereas guardsmen from Cadia and Maudian might hold a line, take shelter, wait for a tactical opportunity, or the cover of darkness, to make an assault, those from Krieg would jump out from their defenses, running silently into a wall of oncoming fire. The soldiers of Krieg are the very definition of grinding down an enemy through attrition. Where others hesitate, the Death Korps of Krieg wields one weapon like no other Imperial Guard regiment, that being sheer blinkered willpower. The human soldiers of the Imperium are spread across hundreds of thousands of hive and bastion worlds. Of the apparent million Imperial planets of the galaxy, which constitutes the domain of humanity, in Mem 41, they look to their own defense and to that of the Imperium itself. They carry out the hell fight of war in the name of the Emperor and engage in those actions as decreed by the Ministratum and the other officials of the Imperium, the Lord Commander, other ranking Imperials, and although the Imperium wields massive military force which spans the entire galaxy, each world which exists under the banner of the Imperium is required to raise its own standing armies. They must also equip and maintain said forces for defense and deployment as requested by the Imperium. The soldiers who maintain defense of hive worlds and other civilized planets are mere militia. Sometimes these are referred to as planetary defense forces. The difference, though, between a planetary militia, which can be quite variable in both their training, equipment, discipline, and just general standards comparative to the Imperium's Astra Militarum, is considerable. For those required for service in the Guard as decreed by the Imperium, demanded via the Imperial tithe or campaign requisition, those of a planetary militia or draft will be called into service. For many, this means their lives will be changed forever, often considerably shortened. They leave behind their past selves as infinitely dispensable, ignorant workers, generally speaking, a class of high peasantry, or, of course, crazed, rabid gang members who proliferate all areas but that of the more civilized levels of hive worlds, and of course, the anonymous but slightly more capable, grinding industrial workers who trudge back and forth from their lives of heavy fabrication and servitude, whose sole life goals are likely a few more credits per month, a warmer hub cell, perhaps even a slightly larger AB cell. But careful now, such fanciful dreams are surely the path to damnation. Better we keep our minds on our work. Too many thoughts, dreams, and questions surely invites the curiosity of supervised enforcers and ecclesiarchy observers. Many within a hive city will, of course, have seen some small sense of combat in their lives. Hive cities are brutally unforgiving places, even for the more calm areas, and for those who cannot stand up for themselves. They will surely be devoured by its darkest corners. Even then, a decent sense of survival and the ability to take a few punches is not nearly enough to serve within the Imperium's Astrum Militarum. Although, of course, in saying that, for a lot of people, they're not going to have a lot of choice, one way, the other. Because when drafted, those anonymous drags of human detritus will be taken and reforged as soldiers of the Imperium, equipped with all their need to serve, standing in tight rows as new and highly disciplined members of the largest of all Imperial armies, which exist in M41, who march to the endless wars against the traitors, the heretics and the Xenos, under the galactic banner of the Imperium of Mankind, the Astra Militarum, the Imperial Guard. All Imperial soldiers are, as noted, equipped as will befit a member of the Imperial Guard at a base level. This merely means being issued with the required standard gear. But the Imperium is large enough that it can, of course, accommodate localized specific weapons and April for the lucky few, those in systems near to infantry specialized forge worlds. They may have access to more refined personal weapons, for example, and be trained in their use. Consequently, some worlds may feel highly specialized units wielding some of the best infantry weapons the Imperium can offer, carrying C plasma guns, melt weapons, other support weaponry upon other worlds, while they may be given the default weaponry of what some would consider the baseline soldiery for the Imperial Guard. The environment of their worlds may dictate other standard issue items. Obviously, on a frozen world, being just issued a standard cading gear isn't going to be enough to weather the sub-zero conditions. Similarly, on a jungle death planet, squads having access to additional scanning tools may mean the difference between a patrol returning or not. For the soldiers of Krieg, their respirators are not merely one for intimidation. That is part of it, but they're essential for those who have learned to fight upon one of the most inhospitable worlds within the Imperium. Their trench shovels are an integral part of their fighting doctrine as well. When brought into close combat, these are surely as lethal as any Kadashan machete or Mordian bayonet. Of course, in theory, should any forces found to be lacking or wanting in any regard, regional commanders or planetary governors should likely be stripped of their positions, their families disgraced, and in the most egregious of examples, additional censure or other punishment, sometimes in public, designated by the powers that be, the Inquisition, Administratum, or the Lord Commander himself, although pretty unlikely. But all of this is just in theory. In actuality, I'd consider it a safe bet that within many campaigns, regiments go to battle with second-hand equipment, and just whatever is to hand, for the veil of propaganda is both blinding and suffocating within the Imperium. Whatever we may presume is the standard operational fare for the many thousands of humans pressed into service, the chances are it's far from the truth. Sometimes better, but far more often worse. The Imperium wields some of the most devastatingly powerful forces in the galaxy, which will not hesitate to throw down against its numerous enemies. Powerful forces, such as the Estates, the Titan legions of the Mechanicus, Night Houses, and countless other surgical, strike tools, such as the members of the Officio Assassinorum. Yet for all the terrifying Xenos threats that exist, or the pervasive, ever-present nightmares of the warp. When it comes down to it, the Imperium spends considerably more time quelling rebellions and civil wars within its own borders. These smaller-scale rebellions are the bread and butter of war in the galaxy of M41. This is why the more human of human forces, such as the Melatan tasks, exist in the first place. They are, of course, pitted against the most horrifying enemies of mankind, but across countless human worlds who attempt to throw off the shackles of the Imperium. These absurd upstart rebellions must be continually put down to maintain the ever-dominating empire of the Emperor of Man's Imperium, and work not for the crushing hammer of the Militarum. The Imperium, as it stands, would simply not survive. These are not the halcyon days of M30, when the legions of estates crushed or welcomed worlds back to humanity. By M41, the estates spend most of their time suppressing and holding the line against far more dangerous and horrifying enemies than a traitorous planetary governor with ideas above his station. So it's not unreasonable to say that without the Imperial Guard, the Imperium would truly struggle to maintain its grip on the galactic dominion of humanity. And I should also note, within the summarized further exploration of Krieg today, there are of course some small spoilers to anyone who wishes to listen to the audiobook first. But with that, let's learn more about the Death Korps of Krieg. The Imperial Guardsmen of Krieg are well known for their ability to weather campaigns which become heavily entrenched stalemates, with subsequent engagements becoming wars of material firepower. One might question how this could even arise, given the nature of warfare in M41 and the ability for orbital firepower. The answer, of course, is relatively straightforward. On planets of the Imperium, which rebel, or whose leadership is overthrown, they often have considerable material resources, as well as holding valuable production and infrastructure systems that, if able to be captured without orbital obliteration, all the better. And this is why you will see round campaigns of hundreds of thousands, even millions of Imperial soldiers, who are very much the most disposable resource. When it comes to the soldiers of Krieg, this mentality is carried forward to its most extreme form. Of course, even for well-disciplined and trained guardsmen, such a long, hazardous engagements can become mentally difficult to maintain the conditions, and steady losses can lead to the slow crushing of the human spirit. Yes, they are the Imperial Guard. They serve the Emperor. But they're still human at the end of the day. And while there will always be those individuals who are zealous in their service, or strong in their willpower, for the considerable majority of ordinary guardsmen, there's only so many months of soul-crushing horror that even the most loyal servants of the Imperium can endure. For those who would seek to flee, of course, they will either be killed outright or pressed into service within the penal legions. But where the conditions are so devastating that it becomes difficult to maintain morale, this is where you would see the Death Korps of Krieg enter the fray. For as we noted, they are truly the masters of attrition. Their ability to weather and endure suffering is near unrivaled, to a point it becomes concerningly morbid, adjacent serving. Imperials who have found themselves being relieved by or having fought alongside the Death Korps have noted it to be extremely disturbing how casually they will expend their lives. So depressing is the loss of life for ordinary guardsmen. Their presence can even be counterproductive for morale with supporting forces. It has been said that on occasion, Commissar have deemed it necessary to in fact order the forces of Krieg from throwing themselves so casually at an enemy, or engaging in acts of self-sacrifice that amounted to a truly depressing waste of human life, in the service of often only achieving minimally important objectives. And even in the face of crushing wars of attrition, they maintain an almost passive emotional level. So the important question is, when did the Death Korps of Krieg begin to display these characteristics? And why do they care so little for their comrades in battle and their own selves? How are they seemingly so fearless? How are they willing to throw away their lives without so much as a second thought? How did they become so adept at battles of material attrition in the worst environmental conditions possible? Why do they wear such terrifying uniforms that are both bleak and intimidating? But most importantly of all, what is underneath those respirator masks? As is very often the case with the history and rumors concerning notable planets, the story of the world known as Krieg is shrouded in half-truths and dark myths. It seems reasonable to assume that given the definition of the world of Krieg may never have understood the translation of its own title. This is not uncommon in M41, where words of ancient human history have completely altered, or their original definition just lost. Yet, it seems of course wildly ironic for a planet which has seen the complete and total annihilation of its own ecosystem, its entire surface scoured and its entire population turned into the production of war alone. It's a poignant and fitting name for such a bleak world of bitter endurance. Krieg in M41 is an extremely irradiated planet. Its entire surface is a nuclear wasteland. Its hive cities are now little more than rubble and ash, its atmosphere unbreathable, or at least to say highly toxic. It remains so inhospitable that even inquisitors who visited for a brief time ended up suffering from its environment and became gravely ill as a result. The Death Korps, though, maintained that despite the extreme conditions, what occurred was absolutely necessary. That their savior, Colonel Jurten, did what had to be done. That he saved the people of Krieg by committing great sin himself. He did his duty. He brought people back to the light of the Emperor via the tools gifted by the Master of Mankind. Those tools were of course, the horrifyingly powerful atomic weapons of the dark age of technology. It's relevant that earlier we noted that within the Imperium, much of the unending war of the far future is in fact fought among humanity itself, and so the fall of Krieg came about not entirely dissimilarly to the world of Rufanon that we've also previously explored. Krieg was at one time a thriving, high-neve and industrial world, not unlike so many other hive worlds. In fact, it was probably not especially noteworthy. Its population, like most hive worlds numbered in the tens of billions, is primarily known. Hive cities were Oros, Ferrograd, and Argentus. And also not unlike many hive worlds, the rulers had become swollen with their industrial achievements and contracts. The upper echelons of many imperial worlds for this reason are very often liven by petty rivalries and family squabbles over power. The autocratic nature of the Imperium trickles down into hive worlds, and as such, inevitably, the rulers of hive worlds fear any threats that could unseat them and rob them of their comfort, wealth, and power. Perhaps those, somewhat unusually, this led in this instance the leaders of the various high cities to steadily invest more and more into their own militias, creating very huge, powerful private armies that stood ready to defend the leadership of the planet against any outside threats, and of course to also limit any threats from others upon the world itself, who might seek to expand their own power. The time at which this begins to become noted in the wider Imperium is when we're introduced to one Colonel Jurten, who, after running highly successful campaigns against Chaos cultists off-world of Krieg and mid-M40, he's interrogated by an Inquisitor, and it's explained that the Administratum and Minitorum are growing concerned about the situation on Krieg, especially the inability to draw reinforcements from the homeworld. Jurten supports their assertions that he's having difficulties in gaining reinforcements himself. So Jurten in the Inquisition share similar concerns to just what is occurring on Krieg. So Colonel Jurten is ordered to return and investigate, replenish his regiment, report back. Things do not go to plan back on Krieg. The leaders there are becoming disillusioned with their required contributions to the Imperium and of the Imperial Administratum, again, not entirely dissimilarly to Raphanon, who took issue with the demands made by the wider Imperium upon their world, both taking issue with their populace having to leave and fight on worlds they've never even heard of, and the appalling flippancy that is given in regard to the loss of human life. This steadily embittered outlook would create a schism in the ruling Council of Krieg as the Imperium demanded ever more resources. The leadership began to argue what it's to do with as they saw necessary. Translation: to defend themselves and maintain their positions of power. I'm returning to Krieg. Jurten sees that this cannot likely end well or with any diplomatic resolution. Predictably shortly after his arrival, the traitors proclaimed publicly their secession from the Imperium, and the so-called chairman orders any non-Krieg to leave the planet in 3 days. Jurten is already very much on the radar of the rebels in short order. Things fall apart. Jurten is contained within Hive Ferograd, while the chairman and his military leadership are within Hive Orlos as the civil war begins. Traitors within Hive Ferograd are being publicly executed. The civilians barely notice anything has changed. They heard one day something about not being in the Imperium anymore, but now they are again under Colonel Jurten. They sure could often badly give it much further thought. Meanwhile, within Hive Oros, things are also not going smoothly for the traitors of the chairman's newly minted Krieg People's Army. Reports are already coming in of attempted sabotage. Small cells of resistance are also making their own preparations in true autocratic fashion. The governor of Krieg ordered any who would stand with him to enforce a planetary martial law. But small arms found civil unrest are now becoming daily occurrences around Hive Oros. I should note, this was not a situation where any worship or corruption of chaos seems to have been involved as a trigger. There's no evidence which points to this. It's likely this was merely a case of a hugely egotistical, power-mad leader. 0. And undoubtedly surrounded by figures who protected them from the oncoming nightmare of reality. So a surprising amount of the planet stayed with the governor's rebelling forces, and consequently, the world fell quite quickly under the general banner of the traitors. Again, noting them being classed as traitors in the specifically non-chaos sense in this instance. Soon after the start of the war, it appears that Colonel Jurten's daughter, Captain Sabala Jurten, appears before the autocratic leadership of the traitors, speaking specifically to the figure known as the chairman. For whatever reason, she appears to be acting against the interests of her father, who she, seemingly, barely knows. With him having spent so much time off-world, she wants to lead a strike team into High Ferrograd. The chairman continues to remain baffled that not all the citizenry are on his side. He blames this dismissively upon the indoctrination of the Imperium and the churches and cathedrals that they in hindsight stupidly allowed to be built upon their world as part of the Imperium. He also decides, like all dictators, to ignore the advice of his generals and orders the very bad decision to settle the unrest in their own hive city of Oros first. Before they worry about how to deal with Colonel Jurten and Ferrograd, they consider that nothing is very likely to happen in the interim. Interestingly, and perhaps against what we might wish to presume, for as traitorous as this chairman, the leader of the rebellion against the Imperium is, he seems far less willing to throw away the lives of the citizenry unless absolutely pushed to do so. Comparative to, say, leaders of the Imperium, which I suppose makes sense when that's one of their core reasons for wanting to secede from the Imperium in the first place. Regardless of that one laudable trait, though he remains a petulant, egotistical leader, unable to tolerate even the smallest criticism of his decisions, and the fact that things are going far from smoothly, and that the world did not immediately fall under his control with a ringing chorus of approval, is already causing tantrums to add to the stress of things. The chairman is then nearly killed by a bomb in his armored limousine within Hive Oros, which they had felt to be their rock-solid home territory. This understandably shakes the chairman of his near assassination, so early into his effort to break free from the Imperium. Many citizens upon the world of Krieg, even within Oros, are not so accepting of this attempt to grab supreme executive power over the world. Colonel Jurten's daughter does lead her mission into High Ferrograd, and the pretext of attempting to assassinate Jurten. But then, surprisingly, she pivots on this, declaring her intention to defect and to join them, allowing herself to be captured. Is this part of some master plan? Though the chairman, under immense pressure, feels pushed into attacking Ferrograd and the Earthen. It's clear that Keneton's unbreakably zealous belief in the Imperium offers no compromise or alternatives. The chairman had seemed unwilling to commit to a civil war without exhausting all other opportunities. But any that were speculated had now been proven all dead ends. Jurten was given a last chance for communications, after which war upon Krieg would properly commence. The rebels' singular objective: to raze Hive City Ferrograd to the ground. It is true that the Loyalists were unfortunately grossly outnumbered, yet they refused to relinquish the world to the traitors who turned against the Emperor. Only their Hive City Ferrograd remained to stand against the power-mad governor and those others who lacked the will to resist. Within Ferrograd, the 83rd Imperial Guard Regiment under Colonel Jurten became a point to which any and all remaining loyalists began to flock. Their situation was far from being enviable. In fact, their situation was bleak, and some would say hopeless. The number of traitor rebels they were facing was a noble sum. Speculated hundreds of thousands of soldiers, some suggested even millions. The total number is not known. Jurten had already received communication that no Imperial fleet was anywhere near a distance to which it could soon help them to secure the world. They were outnumbered, cut off, and their impending destruction seemed inevitable. His orders, though, were clear. Resist. Resist by any means necessary, no matter the cost. Engage the enemy. Stand, fight, and punish the traitors. Make them suffer. make them regret their outrageous error, and show them how the Imperium responds to such audacious treachery. Bold words, but undoubtedly the communications sent by whichever Imperial authority had connected with Jurten were unable to completely appreciate the impossible situation they were in. The nature of long-distance communication within the Imperium and its astropaths is far from crystal clear. Nonetheless, they had communicated with clarity what he must do in this situation. Still, Hive Ferrograd was a heavily reinforced hive city of production. This helped the Loyalists put the traitors at a distinct disadvantage, unable to easily then resupply themselves. Thereby they were forced into assaulting the Loyalists at Ferrograd first. Despite their much higher numbers, time was not on their side, and the 83rd Regiment of Jurten were all experienced in this kind of embedded defensive mission. So all they could realistically do, for now, was hold the line and wait for some opportunity to present itself. Many hoped that when Hive Oros would begin to run low on resources, they may be able to force some kind of compromise, at least until Imperial reinforcements could arrive. But 18 months in, both sides of fighting ever more bitterly. Trench networks have appeared. Continual air assaults and artillery are pounding back and forth. Krieg's war will be lost by the first side to exhaust their resources. Every soldier, every citizen of Ferrograd has to pull their weight. Jurten forces had two major factors on their side. The first was their unwavering commitment to the Emperor of Mankind, while the chairman's forces, they thought, fought for nothing. Not exactly sure that's true, though, because arguably the chairman's forces were fighting for their own freedom, which is a pretty motivating factor. However, Jurten held one significant ace up his sleeve, and that ace was named Archmagos Grill. Grill was a long-serving companion of Jurten's, and often knew his decisions before he made them himself. He was an extremely adept member of the Mechanicus, but Jurten despised his modifications and inhuman approach to matters. They were very much chalk and cheese, but depended on each other greatly. Grill had so far drawn up plans to modify the Loyalists' last weapons. It was a more powerful iteration of the standard Lanskin, but consumed more energy per shot. Jurten deemed this an acceptable trade-off. Its users would simply have to pick their shots and be accurate, but if they could make them count, it would give them an edge in combat. The war would continue in a miserable back and forth, steadily grinding each other down. It's claimed by Imperial history that the chairman then died somewhere around this time, a sickly, broken shell of a man with many sundry aches and pains. His weakened self made a permanent retreat to his bedchamber, where he would remain to wallow in his woes, not to mention in his silk sheets, fine food, and potent drink. He remained extremely comfortable as long as he could blot out everything beyond his four walls. This was impossible to do, of course, and so his heart ached with resentful self-pity. According to the Imperial side of things, he gave in to lethargy, eventually struggling even to rise from his bed. In his mind he'd failed his world, fractured forever, and all he could do was cling to his self-appointed title, unwilling to accept any responsibility for his own shortcomings and the blood on his hands. He sort of caused to blame it all upon one man whose name he frequently cursed. Yet even then he couldn't fully accept the reality of this, because were he to do so, he would have to attempt to reconcile the fact that it was he who authorized Jurten's ship to enter orbit and dock within Hive Ferrograd. This must have posed a difficult paradox for the chairman. His situation, all of his own making, but unable to face the harsh reality of his utter personal failure. It is said that one day, in his isolation, his servants failed to appear. In his indignant rage, he rang for them harder and harder. But then he could hear footsteps and raised voices. Then came the gunshots, followed by cries. His fattened, struggling heart was on the brunt of bursting. Sweat poured down him, and he attempted to flail his clammy, cold body out of his grand silk bedchamber. One of his servants burst in, hurriedly trying to block the door. As they attempted to flee, suddenly the door blasted into splinters. Yellow gas poured in from the corridor outside. The chairman was sent, crashing to the floor, the mist burning his skin and lungs. Room suddenly filled with dark, towering figures, wheezing through their skull masks. A plea tumbled off his tongue. "I'll give you anything you want." But it's said that out of lifelong habit, he also uttered a prayer to the emperor, which went unanswered. His eyes, finally attuned to the monsters in the yellow fog, with their leering skulls instead of faces, black eyes and distended snouts. Those who still recall this time claim that here the chairman broke down in tears of bitter regret and repented of his heresies, though no one can know this for sure. The last thing he would see were that of the masked face of a loyalist, breathing heavily through their respirator, looking down. Without pity or malice, some claim they killed him there and then, with a powerful asbolt to the head. Others, that the poison gas would surely have melted his skin and began to liquefy his brain, an agonizing death, and surely more appropriate than wasting ammunition. None can know the truth for sure. This, though, is where things become more complicated. It had been presumed that the death of the chairman may enable some kind of compromise or de-escalation of the situation. But it soon became clear this was certainly not the case. Colonel Jurten and the traitor General Kraus would converse at length about the situation, but it becomes apparent that the enemy remain as embittered and blinkered as ever. The death of the chairman has changed nothing at all. To make matters worse, it appears that Jurten's daughter perished in their planned assassination assault against the chairman. Colonel Jurten was too iron-willed an individual to be shaken by such a revelation. They knew this was a risk on any mission, yet it certainly did nothing to pacify the entrenched positions of loyalists and traitor. The traitors merely reiterated their objections of remaining under the subjugation of the emperor, that they did not accept. The reality of being forced to endure and sacrifice their lives for the anonymous Imperium beset against horrors of the galaxy. Again, this is a common complaint by any who choose to rise up against the Imperium. The situation for the Loyalists is looking increasingly bleak, and under even heavier bombardment from the air. They've begun digging deep under their hive city, widening tunnels and storage facilities, creating a city below the city. The Archmagos reveals to Jurten that there exists a stock of technology below the surface from the Dark Age. It's unknown precisely what is contained, leaving Jurten uncertain about what they could be potentially unleashing upon the planet in the near future. But he and the remaining loyalists had, of course, committed to following their orders to the letter. They must find some way by which to deny the planet to the traitors as was dictated to them, at any cost, by any means necessary. Interestingly, despite how history often considers his actions, it's revealed to us that Colonel Jurten was originally strongly against the use of atomic weapons. The Archmagos explained that as they originated from the Dark Age, the Mechanicus only had fragments of their schematics, and so were unwilling to dismantle them for fear of accidentally detonating them. So instead, vaults like this one must remain locked away. It was said, though, that even one of the weapons could be enough to contaminate and strongly poison the land for many generations, and just one would be enough to effectively destroy an entire hive city. The difficulty, though, was in their delivery. Such slow and obvious missiles would generally easily be intercepted by fighters or air defenses of a hive city, making a direct attack problematic. As the war continues to grind on, Jurten is seeing a distinct lack of progression, and so then begins to consider that maybe the cost of lives in the use of a nuclear weapon is warranted to end the overall conflict. This harsh rationalization proves to be extremely disturbing to his close aides, so much so that they choose to even anonymously contact the traitor General Kraus in a vague attempt to dissuade him from pushing the war further, out of fear that Jurten may then actually use the deadly Dark Age weapons. Unfortunately, without an explicitly detailed explanation, General Kraus is unable and unwilling to really comprehend the threat that is being posed. Nor does he even believe it's a serious threat. Perhaps it's just mind games to put them at some disadvantage. But Kraus also felt a troubling gut feeling, a gnawing sting of unease, something he remembers about the chairman, speaking of long-ago stories of weapons from the Dark Age, before the Age of Strife. He tried hard to recall, but couldn't specifically draw the information. He was probably just being paranoid, overthinking things. One of Jurten's trusted officers is panicking about the use of these weapons, and in doing so attempts to visit the vault where they're being kept, only to find, to his horror, they have all been removed. Of course, they've been removed by Jurten and Grill, and things are now reaching a critical point. Jurten had clearly spent many weeks and months calculating all possibilities in coordination with Archmagos Grill. He was a straight-talking and period officer, and his belief in the Emperor so strong that he felt no shame in his conclusions. There was nothing to hide here. Nothing that couldn't be discussed. In his mind, they had limited options, because realistically, the alternatives were surrender, failure, and certain death. The enemy would not entertain any compromise. Plus, Colonel Jurten had been ordered not to accept any himself. So he would clearly lay out to his officers the situation and the strategy. Even to those that he clearly knew had considerable fears or doubts, he explained to them calmly and clearly exactly what these weapons were, why and how he planned to use them. Jurten did not ask for any opinions on his strategy. He made statements, as always. He would declare exactly what was going to happen and how it must be carried out. To him, there was no alternative other than to launch a preemptive strike against the enemy hive city. They felt confident that by sending one missile first, the surprise of using a weapon that the enemy had no ability to expect nor understand would demonstrate the power they hold and the futility of continuing the war. Shockingly, after this meeting, the officers attempt to relieve Jurten from duty. Suspiciously, he calmly agrees, only to have loyal elites launch a surprise attack and kill them, all with the earth, and then delivering a final execution to his closest rebelling aide. No mercy, no compromise. The stubborn defiance, actions confidence and attitude of Colonel Jurten clearly display the 10 template for the Death Korps of Krieg. The man was absolutely unshakable. And ammonia. He never even intended to create the death coin in the first place. They simply came into existence out of necessity. With the execution of his rebelling officers, there is nothing to stop Colonel Jurten from unleashing nuclear apocalypse upon the world of Krieg. In these last moments, though, Jurten makes an additional devastating further calculation. He rationalizes that one missile is not enough, because whilst one missile, even if it were to successfully hit its target, inevitably risks retaliation by the powerful air force of the traitors. If they were to mark the missile silo as a target in retaliation, they'd be finished. He also considered, philosophically, that at this point, no matter the actions that were taken, the world he once knew was already dead. It couldn't be saved, in the true sense. At this point, the war, the bitterness, the factions were far too embedded. Thus Jurten concludes his only option is the annihilation of the world old, using all the atomic weapons, a conclusion that Archmagos Grill had already long realized, but chose not to even voice. As all the missiles were fired, few of them, enemy could really comprehend what they were seeing. Such weaponry was far beyond the experience of anyone in this time. So few wilds had experienced the forbidden weapons of the dark age of humanity, despite the advanced time for the humans in the Imperium. So even the traitors in their city were unable to comprehend what Jurten had hoped to achieve. With such a small burst of missiles, a tiny volley would do nothing to their hard and reinforced outer walls of Hive City Oros. The general was alerted, but remained entirely unconcerned, strangely. Though these missiles appear to be flying straight up, they were not seeking any specific target. The reasoning, of course, was that directly targeting enemy positions or the hive was calculated to be now too risky. The missiles would probably be intercepted, and this is why Jurten and the Archmagos had decided to explode them in a manner that would ensure maximum destruction, albeit of a different kind of destruction, one of a slow poisoning death, purge rather than instant annihilation. So the scores of missiles would raw their way out from High Ferrograd as the trait of rebels watched on, confused and exposed across the open planet's surface. The hive cities of the traitors took no immediate action. Vents were not closed, protective shields not raised. None were able to understand their impending slow extermination. It should be noted that nuclear weapons are still very much used by the Imperium in the 41st millennium, but they're likely far more powerful than when they were originally conceived in the unknowable history of humanity. The mechanics understand their power, not to mention generally being fearful of anything which originates from the Dark Age or beyond, because, although it might appear clear what it is supposed to be, who knows once you start messing around with the mysterious languages from the Dark Age. So weapons such as these are usually kept, as we said, are locked down heavily by the Mechanicus, only to be used in the most severe combat engagements. The fact that Imperial cyclonic torpedoes or other weapons used in the process of exterminatus are objectively more powerful should not understate the fear of causing the long-term irradiated damage to our planet. This is why only during the Crusade and the subsequent heresy did you see Space Marine destroyer squads using rad weapons after the heresy. These were effectively outlawed, and you very rarely see standard Imperial units using radiation-based weapons now because of the long-term damage that can be caused. So most of the weapons fired from High Ferro, Grand, were deliberately detonated, high, unleashing tons of lethal material and turning the very atmosphere of the world into a nuclear fire. The consequences of this would be a total collapse of the planet's ecosystem unclear, and climate bizarre storms raged across the world, and the planet's sun was heavily obscured by the nuclear winter, which now consumed the entire planet. Of course, Jurten's forces have been apparently prepared in advance for this event. Even if they didn't know the specifics, someone left at their stations outside, presumably to maintain appearances, and the Archmagos presumably had the equipment necessary to help protect the Loyalists from the very worst conditions that were to come, as well as closing down all ventilation into their hive and water systems. Civilian population. Papage was secured deep underground. The traitor General Kraus would live long enough to see the devastation that Jurten had unleashed. His extreme bitterness and outrage must have been entirely visible. Both sides of the Civil War and Krieg were so dug in, literally, that when Jurten had last communicated to Kraus, he did not even attempt to discuss any possibility of surrender or compromise. It was clear that no discussion could be had, no chance of saving the world. Yet for Kraus, this new reality was something he could not have anticipated, made any worse by his now impending defeat. If not today, then surely very soon. Until this moment, the idea that he might lose the conflict or that there were any chance of any other outcome than their glorious victory had not even entered their minds. But now, as he looked across the feeds and reports of a burning world, a planetary ecosystem collapse, an atmosphere that was burning, his soldiers scrambled for any cover they could across the wasteland, between hive cities, now pinned down by acid rain that burned through their armor and skin. For the leaders, this was intolerable too. C. Kraus retreated to his quarters and shut himself into isolation. Meanwhile, panic was spreading among the traitors. They were leaderless, and their world was spiraling into a hellish nightmare in real time. Fields were burning. Casualty reports were everywhere. Water supplies contaminated internal hive city atmospheres. Toxicity readings were off the scale. For the general, some part of him undoubtedly, even now, was unwilling to accept defeat. There was too much pride, too much ego to face reality. Yet he felt undoubtedly panicked, for he could do nothing to stop this oncoming apocalypse. It is presumed that rather than face the impossible situation head-on, the traitor, General Kraus, took his own life. The trait of propaganda, of course, spun other stories to cover for the fact that they were the ones who had been led down this path to their own destruction. Kraus, like the chairman before him, and so many random anonymous dictators across the galaxy, were left with a choice between remaining completely disconnected from reality and facing the fact that he had severely underestimated the enemy. He'd been consumed by his own hubris lust for power, arrogance, and that it was all of this together which had now brought complete annihilation to their world. Interestingly, although the most likely outcome, even Imperial loyalists were not satisfied with this explanation, because it would mean that Kraus had escaped the ever-present wrath and inevitable justice of the Imperium. Colonel Jurten would be the first to see this new world. He wanted to see it with his own eyes, despite this being unnecessary. They had vid feeds that could show them the situation on the surface. But Jurten felt it important that he bear witness to the horror he had unleashed upon his world. He wore a face respirator to protect from the highly toxic air that would burn him internally. He wore a heavy coat to protect against the intense cold and some of the radiation blowing across the world. Those at the surface level may never see the sun again. Unknowingly, Jurten would be the first to wear the uniform that would soon become synonymous with the planet of Krieg for any of the traitor rebels who were left. Outside and within, also the other hive worlds, they would suffer considerably more. The severe radiation that fell upon the planet, far more than even the most ancient weapons of humanity, would lead to the steady deaths of billions, not to mention the physical harm immediately caused. The survivors remained wounded, disheveled, disorientated, generally in a state of shock. And this is where Jurten's Death Riders began to scour enemy lines of survivors. A small, adjacent note. One of the very notable units of Krieg, before and after the apocalypse, were their Death Riders, as the hugely destructive war had raged. Across Krieg, it had become increasingly difficult for both loyalists and traitors to use tanks on other vehicles, primarily because of the ongoing war of attrition, and this meant that logistical supplies quickly became scarce, coupled with the knowledge and the manpower needed to pilot the vehicles and keep them operational. This was impeded severely, as the casualty list increased exponentially every day. On top of this, the devastating use of artillery and trenches meant the land itself became extremely difficult to traverse. So the Archmagos had the, surprisingly non-mechanicus, idea to use mounted cavalry to give them an edge over the enemy, breeding and heavily genetically modifying the variety of equine on the world was not a challenging task, gifting it a physique far stronger than a Terran horse. Its new adaptation enabled the mount to power through thick mud or over rubble with its blade feet. Also better to adapting and moving in difficult or nearly impossible terrain. They could be bred quite quickly with the technology available, and so war horses were raised to be ridden, a specially trained cavalry. Companies for the Loyalists. Psychologically, these creatures are far more aggressive than their domestic Terran ancestors, with drug injectors being used to make the creature fearless in the face of an enemy in battle. The creature will charge directly into the foe's lines and will not be startled by weapons fire or explosions. Due to the Krieg steed's unstable body chemistry, it has to be constantly monitored by its rider and stabilized with additional chemicals. This means the creature can sustain also injuries that would kill lesser creatures. Believes. Many of these mounts with horrible scars from previous wounds. The results, even prior to the apocalypse, were impressive and often caught the enemy completely by surprise. The speed of their attacks in the horrifying conditions, combined with them being very easily replaceable, made them valuable for a variety of roles. In the aftermath, the steeds of Krieg were even more critical, enabling fast raids on heavily weakened enemy positions, allowing the riders to attack or recon enemy trench lines and return to the safety of the hive, while minimizing their time out in the open air. The Kriegsdeed would be equipped with armor to protect its head, and a respirator system was adapted to protect them as it would their riders from poison gases and toxic atmospheres. In the modern period, these death ride mounts would now be grown in vitogenic cloning vats, deep below the surface, with their gestation carefully monitored by the Mechanicus biologists. They're all branded at the genetic level for any necessary identification purposes, so the extreme conditions that now this existed on the planet's surface also meant that realistically, any major assaults between the hive cities was becoming quickly impossible, at least in the short term, thus enabling Jurten and the Loyalists more time to dig in, consolidate their positions, and resist against the rebels who were reeling from a massive change to the planet and their own hive cities and populations were heavily contaminated. Their leaders' arrogant overconfidence meant that the attack had caught them at their weakest and least prepared. They suffered heavily, period. During the initial fallout, while the planet was being lashed by nuclear fire, and the extremely strong radioactive fallout crippled a massive amount of the enemy forces, who are now either extremely sickened, walking wounded, blinded, or any other number of ailments. Many were just suffering from extreme mental depression and disillusionment at the state of their world. At this point, suffice to say, the world to fight and the morale of the enemy was at rock bottom. Many would surrender, take their own lives, or just engage in pointless assault. The nuclear annihilation, unleashed by Colonel Jurten, had turned the prosperous industrial and agricultural world into a barren, dead, radiated wasteland. Krieg was no longer a hive world. It had become quite literally the most feared classification of Imperial planet, a death world for those mainly loyalists who lived to see the aftermath. This event would become known as the Purging. Surprisingly, though, the devastation only really evened the odds for the loyalists. Which sounds surprising, but still, even odds was far better than certain destruction. But it did come at a horrifying cost. For the planet, Colonel Jurten, of course, had very few cards to play, and so we might consider that it was perhaps a little unfair that after hearing of the destruction of Krieg, the Imperium no longer saw Krieg as a viable planet, meaning it was no longer worth investing resources to recover or save the loyalists of Krieg were effectively abandoned, and the Imperium communicated it had no further plans to send nor deploy any reinforcements to aid the loyalists. Now, Imperial Guard, certainly no Astartes, Colonel Jurten and his remaining loyalists were left to fight this war themselves, the outcome of which would determine their ultimate fate, acceptance of some form back into the Imperium, or an unknown fate, potentially permanent isolation upon a dead world, or even some final act of complete annihilation to scour any remaining traitors from the planet, likely exterminatus. For the people of Krieg, after this act of extreme destruction, the war did not end. Their world was now changed forever. And what remained was a truly miserable, bleak reality that awaited all who had survived. They now entered into a protracted and extremely difficult period of continuing the fighting amid the now extreme and apocalyptic environment of their planet's surface. The atmospheric conditions allowed for little, if any, air cover. And so the war further devolved into a horrific planetary trench warfare. Week by week, each side would extend their lines and fortifications into every space that could be filled, contained to dugout trenched defenses, razor wire, and bunkers. There is very little information about this grueling war of attrition between the loyalists and traitors, likely due to the fact that one week became another, and another, and another. Lives were lost, ground gained, lost, enemy killed, ground gained, and lost. Various factors complicated the war, not least the environment above the surface, but also, of course, the distances between the hive cities, which were now very difficult to navigate, and littered with a vast, labyrinthine trench networks. Artillery bombarded the enemy day and night. In rare extreme events, it said that there were even still additional atomics used. But just how or where or which side were using these is unknown. So, When Jurten and his forces finally assaulted Hive Argentis, the remnants of humanity they encountered were ragged, uncoordinated, carrying badly functioning weaponry. They lacked strength, willpower, were truly pitiful creatures. But as Jurten exclaimed, they were the ones who brought this horror to their world. Which is obviously very arguable. But they were to be shown no mercy, only death. They were slaughtered, more like putting them out of their misery. Despite Jurten's proclamations, many months later, the new fighters of the Loyalists were being referred to as corpsmen, those who were sent out into the wastes, were ever more ferocious in their loyalists to zeal, and they were laser-focused on their singular task to bring death to the enemy. It was said that not long after Jurten learned how the population of High Ferrograd had begun referring to these as the Death Korps, the Death Korps of Krieg. The name stuck. Colonel Jurten would die of a weakened body, state not too long after this period. Jurten was an officer who believed there should be no observable difference between officers of the Imperium and the soldiers they would command. He always would stay within court as comparable to his own men for Jurten. He would often state that the only difference between an officer and lower-ranked soldiers was the level of responsibility. He was a humble man, and so in death, or upon other worlds, the passing of such a critical officer would warrant ostentatious marble statues, worked upon by master artisans, plaques to adorn public spaces, and stories told to the new generations. Upon Krieg, the death of Jurten was merely a footnote in one or other of the data files. But still, all knew his name. All knew his name. Importance. The people of Krieg would never allow him to be forgotten. Yet his death and legacy, generally, would pass without audacious commentary. What endured from the man who followed his orders absolutely stood strong against traitors and would destroy an entire world as the Emperor's representative, rather than kowtow to the mad ravings of a power-mad despot, was his unbreakable sense of willpower. Colonel Jurten was in perhaps more ways than just the aspirational, the template to which all Krieg guardsmen who came between then and now would follow. If an order is given, it must be followed at any cost. If an objective cannot be saved, then better it be destroyed. If a world cannot be defended, it should burn. Better that than it fall to the traitors and heretics. Most importantly, of course, no sacrifice should be too great in service to the Imperium and the Emperor of mankind, and what occurred within his final hours, and in the time since his passing, would shape the reputation and future for the people of Krieg forevermore. One of the greatest questions all have wondered is what lies behind the masks of the Death Korps of Krieg. Even the Inquisition have forced the issue when first encountering the Death Korps upon the world's reunification with the Imperium. As always, I want to be clear that the answer remains unclear. It has not been stated specifically what lies behind the masks of the Death Korps. However, we can reasonably, strongly speculate based on the information available. For one, we know that the Inquisition have forcibly ordered Krieg, officers and soldiers, to remove their masks. And although what they saw was unrevealed to us, the fact that the Death Korps continued to remain in service points to them not being abhorrent mutants, traitors, heretics, or otherwise. There have been many obvious speculations over the years, and the one which is often repeated, the one with the most weight behind it, does seem to be the case that the Death Korps of Krieg are something akin to a clone army. Now, just how? Close that practice is a pond creek is not entirely clear, but it does point to their usage of the vitae womb, and the fact that this is frowned upon by the Mechanicus biologists. In the final hours of Colonel Jurten's life, Archmagus Grill presses him to make a decision about the soldiers of Krieg. Grill remonstrates with the Jurten that only his strength of leadership, only his willpower, his character, can be certain to endure the future horrors that are necessary to carry the Loyalists through to the distant time when they will finally reunite with the Imperium. Colonel Jurten is one of those figures who really likes to be in control. He wants to do everything himself. He feels frustrated when he leaves it to others, and Grill attempts to essentially leverage this feeling, saying, "Do you trust leaving Krieg in the hands of these other officers? But yet, and when pushed, will not submit to Grio's pressuring. Sometime later, when called upon by the new command of the Loyalists, the Archmagos lies to the new senior officers in charge of Hive Ferrograd after the passing of Colonel Jurten. He insists that Jurten wanted to mandate the use of the so-called vitae wombs to be used by Krieg, to the shock of the officers in the room. The birth rate, though, was declining, mutations increasing, and it appears that the Archmagos tricked the Krieg population into the use of the vitae wounds, because they were now in the belief that this was Colonel Jurten's dying wish, something they could not, of course, oppose. The reality was that he went to his death choking strongly on his protestation of any such action. Anyone who truly knew Colonel Jurten would have known that he would not have been more strongly opposed to anything that artificially interferes in human development as he had been his entire life. Seemingly now, as I've talked about before, we do not know precisely how vitae wombs work, or even what they are, but it is suggestive that they require some kind of initial implantation. From the way in which Archmagos Grill speaks to them, it sounds as if a fertilized embryo is required to be placed within this womb, but then it is also genetically modified, so that it grows into what is near enough a clone of Colonel Jurten. It feels like something along those lines, but again, it's really my own just logical assumptions on the information we have. It's just heavily implied by the conversations between the Archmagos and Jurten and the others. Hence the fact that he was so angrily resistant to the use of vitae worms, plus the fact that the Mechanicus biologists frown so heavily upon their use. The Mechanicus in general and the Imperium appear to generally hate anything that appears to be clone-based. It seems to go strongly against the strange ethical rules for the Imperium. Look at the Astartes. They're not clones. They're individuals who are just adapted to become a space Marines, but it's very weird that the Imperium has these kind of sort of ethical qualms, because they don't seem to apply these ever for anything else. And when they do, it's usually not for the reasons you'd want or expect. Archmagos Grill believed that the only way for the Krieg armies to be powerful enough to survive a war of attrition was for their number to be filled with the strongest warriors possible. Those who could decisively win in battles, who were unbreakable servants to the Emperor, and who were uncompromising in every respect. Essentially, he was suggesting that they would create an army of Colonel Jurtens. He didn't say that, but it seems to be what he's suggesting. There's also this implied sense that Archmagos Grill always knows what has to be done, and what would be eventually the conclusion before Jurten knew it himself. So in that sense, in Colonel Jurten's deathbed, Grill understands that his protestations were merely the delay point between the clarity he would eventually gain in realizing this was an action that had to be taken, and so Grill basically joins the dots. This is generally pretty normal, actually, for Mechanicus as well, because they're often far ahead in thought processes compared to ordinary humans. Grill seemed to be just a very patient member of the Mechanicus, and was allowing Colonel Jurten to work it out for himself, so as to not draw his irritation. Plus, there's always that thing of if you try and force someone to have an opinion, it never really works. But if you let them get there themselves, by just giving them the information and enabling them to figure it out, even if it takes some time, they're going to be much more on board. Plus, it probably helps in the long run. So, there are many subtle references to this. It's just kind of reading between the lines. For one, Jurten speaks about wishing that he could be the one to meet face to face with the Imperium and show them just what he had achieved. Grill also knew this. He knows that it had been Colonel Jurten's dream to raise this vast army upon the world that would stun and shock the Imperium when they eventually returned, which, of course, it did. Lastly, there's the most glaring detail that the officer of the Kriegsmen, who first revealed his name to the Imperium, announces himself as one Colonel Jurten, which he obviously isn't. This is combined with the fact that the Krieg guardsmen also just generally appear confused when they meet the Imperium after such a long time. They're asked what their names are. They seem very confused by this because they have no personal identity. They don't need names. Now, of course, I have to add, we could speculate that this was just a symbolic act, that the Krieg merely continue the honor of Colonel Jurten by carrying his name forward. But I think the reality, with what we know of what took place in the aftermath, the sheer pressing necessity of the Vitae wombs, this constant air of unease about their use, everybody seems to understand that they're pretty dodgy. But just without actually explaining why AI, the fact that the Kriegsmen never removed their face masks, it's all heavily suggestive of, if not a clone army, at least something very close to it. The apocalyptic surface of Krieg was now a ghostly dystopian wasteland, the very soil of which could contaminate and heavily sicken you. Vast craters pockmarked the planet from the repeated artillery strikes, many so deep that any who fell in were as good as dead themselves. Pits of death which were filled with shattered remnants of humans from generations previous. All manner of horrifying anti-infantry weapons littered the surface, from impossibly dense thickets of rusted wire to devious shredding mines, which jumped out without warning to cut you off at the legs, waist, or just shred your body entirely. Any attempts to advance and secure trenches were extremely dangerous. The enemy would always lay traps and tools to sabotage advances. Over time, the battling forces upon Krieg had begun to develop a look that was indeed necessary for their survival across the inhospitable trench wastelands. Inspired by Colonel Jurten as he adventured into the wastes on that first day, they wore standardized, heavy greatcoats to protect them from the frozen environment and distinctive respirators to protect against the toxic atmosphere, which unfortunately for the soldiers of Krieg now had to be worn basically at all times. Over time, many would stylize their face masks with a skull-like decal, but this was not really for intimidating the enemy, although it often could be, because their battles were often really fought at distance with artillery, and when they actually did fight close enough in a battle to see one another, both were wearing respirator masks. So I know the skull design for most of the Death Korps was to indicate their total acceptance of their own death. It was a symbolic thing. Most squads had very high rates of casualties, even now fighting against the weakened enemy, in addition to the more obvious. Pieces of kit, leg greaves, could be worn for extra protection, or otherwise tightly wrapped compression cloths on the legs to help with the long periods spent standing in cold, filthy trenches. Depending on their role, equipment could vary slightly in terms of specific carapace armor. Helmets and other shoulder, knee, and shin guards were generally made of plasteel, reinforced with a ceramite layer. These are said to be heat-resistant and were lesser in weight to other options. Nonetheless, all of this outerwear, worn atop their standard issue uniform, made it quite cumbersome and difficult to move in. Not so much of a problem when you're standing around in trenches, and this meant that the gear was only generally worn during static engagements or defensive operations. Whilst any of course welcomed the protection of the heavy carapace plates, it would be sometimes necessary to discard these for fast-moving, extended operations, such as attempting to breach enemy positions. For the coming generations, all they would know was war and underground life. They would know was war and underground life were brought into a world with no sky above them, only darkness. Toxic pollution, the inevitability and visible presence of death, and the inhuman machinery and execution of industrial-scale warfare in M41. And so the grinding battle for Krieg continued. On its soldiers developed this apathetic indifference to human life. But for the Loyalists, their goal remained to crush the traitors, who through their sheer arrogance and doubt as to the willpower of those who serve the Imperium, had unwittingly enabled both the destruction of their world and the arrival of some of the most unbreakable human soldiers that existed within the Imperial Guard. The Loyalist soldiers who ventured into the irradiated wastelands of Krieg were no longer the 83rd who had served under Colonel Jurten. The soldiers who now walked unwaveringly into their inevitable deaths, all but anonymously. For those who would fight in dark, freezing trenches, who charged enemy lines and battled through broken, destroyed ruins of former hive cities, these unbreakable warriors became known. Among the survivors of the Loyalists, the Death Korps of Krieg. Their existence remained to serve and die upon the hellish environment of Krieg, to crush the enemies of the Imperium, in the Emperor's name, and through half a millennia of grinding attrition and brutal industrial war. This is exactly what they did. The citizens of Krieg by now had developed new cities in the only area they could now survive, below the surface. Meanwhile, the Death Korps continued to fight with unrelenting determination, regularly in hand-to-hand combat, with bayonet and shovel, over mere meters of trenches. They would fight in the darkness of subterranean tunnels, while the freezing, blasted wastelands, bludgeoning their enemies into submission amid the blood, mud, and shattered human remains. Krieg would eventually be returned to the Imperium, but not until the late period of M40. The Imperium had, of course, been monitoring the situation on Krieg. It had just remained unwilling to contribute any resources to what had presumed to be a lost cause. General opinion as to what had occurred upon Krieg remained unsurprisingly not a positive one. So despite the enduring efforts of the Loyalist people of Krieg, despite their near incalculable sacrifice and centuries of suffering by those serving in the Death Korps, there was no celebration or relief for Krieg when it returned to the Imperium. In fact, quite the contrary. The people of Krieg were simply met with a terse, emotionless period. statement that the world of Krieg had been assessed as now being behind on paying the Imperial tithe. The delays caused by this unnecessary civil war meant that Krieg now was heavily in debt to the wider Imperium. As with the majority of Imperial hive worlds, the Imperial tithe was to be paid by contribution of soldiers for the Munitorum. However, the adepts of the Minotaurum, who had perhaps expected protestation from the newly liberated world of Krieg, was shocked when the representatives who, joined them aboard the Imperial ship in orbit of the world offered up 20 whole regiments, and additionally requested them to be deployed to the most severe of war zone environments. Now, interject here with a small adjacent reference, because this is not an uncommon action of self-penance. It's similar to the planet of Vostroya, which you may have also heard of during the heresy. Vostroya refused to provide soldiers and materials to either side of the conflict. Extremely bizarrely, they had somehow determined their best bet was to remain neutral, undamaged, and productive. Oddly, the ruling authority of the world had presumed that by remaining impartial, this would then limit damage to the world, and of course, by not siding with anyone, come off all the better for it. On the other side, obviously, this is not how things turned out in the aftermath of the heresy. This decision by Vostroya was not viewed positively. In fact, the opposite. Realizing their catastrophic error and the impending heavy punishment headed their way, the Australian leadership would make a declaration to the Imperium in an attempt to prevent it being punished even more severely, that every firstborn child of the world would be sworn to the Imperium service forevermore. 10,000 years have passed since then, but for the people of Vostroya in M421, not all are aware about the specific details, but the scar upon their world cuts so deep that even now, millennia later, all know that when the Emperor needed them, they turned away, and this deep, deep shame has meant that ever since that time, they continued to commit their firstborn to forever fight in the name of the Imperium, in an attempt to scrub clean their indelible stain of shame which remains upon their world, and in the light of the Imperium always will. So the point is that, like of Australia, the leadership of Krieg at the end of M40 understood that although they had avoided total annihilation in one sense, they now needed to show the Imperium that it was still a planet worth saving. Not to mention, of course, fulfilling Colonel Jurten's long-standing wish and order. They should deliver a mighty army to demonstrate how successful he had carried out his campaign upon Krieg, and how the world could still remain important for the Imperium. Although collapse of the planet into civil war was not the fault of the Loyalists, the fact remained that the sheer scared of waste that had occurred upon a previously stable and productive Imperial planet was undeniable. The deployment of the new Death Korps Imperial Guard units was a resounding success, to the considerable surprise and shock of those within the Munitorium. The Death Korps quickly proved themselves far superior, entering into engagements that had ground to a halt with other regiments, most obviously in war zones that mirrored Krieg itself, toxic environments, polluted ashen worlds, and where other guard forces had struggled considerably. The Krieg soldiers carried on as if it were very literally a world without any such inhospitable conditions to contend with, to the astonishment of their superiors. Senior officers were in awe as the Death Korps broke bitter stalemates with ease and achieved strategic advances that would have otherwise required the slaughter of thousands of penal legion troops to achieve the same results. In some instances, Imperial officers had been waiting for Astartes' assistance to resolve hard-to-crack situations, but the Death Korps of Krieg stepped in and immediately smashed the problem. So now Krieg exists as purely a world of war, both in its production, but also the fighting continues across its heavily scarred terrain. But why? Very simple training for the Death Korps, because it of course became apparent that the death call was so effective because they had been tempered in the brutally unforgiving warfare that had raged across their planet for centuries and the Imperium. Stop. You have gotten your sufficient quota. You are being offered an indigenous recording all week long, and summaries are definitely critical. Yes, you may have suffered a painful death, but indigenous recordings are definitely relevant. Definitely, the entry of every paging item is catered to the tone and pacing accurately. Continues to demand this standard level of skill and service. From the Death Court the remains, above other guardsmen, the Death Korps faced such a high rate of attrition and destruction wherever they're sent to, that consequently they must be steeled to face such nightmarish conditions where an ordinary hive planet may raise one new guard regiment per year. Krieg continues to contribute as many as 10 per P. The Imperium remains insatiable in M41. It needs more and more of the Death Korps to fight in its ever more extreme wars, such as Octarius and the ongoing war fought in, around, and through the Cicatrix Maledictum. While the Death Korps are undoubtedly highly skilled, disciplined, and unbreakable, they also lean heavily on their nature of being disposable to achieve victory, and this can often be used to an advantage, especially when they have already been fighting more standard Imperial Guard. It can catch an enemy by surprise, as suddenly they throw themselves against scenarios that would be considered entirely pointless engagements, and while this brings the Death Korps victory, it often will come at an extortionately high cost in human life and material equipment. Sometimes this is warranted, but other times it can in fact be somewhat counterproductive, which remains this strange duality for the Death Korps of Krieg. Effective a sledgehammer to an enemy, but bleak and demoralizing for any adjacent forces who have to cooperate and support them. For the distant eyes of the Imperial Administratum in the Minitamanum, however, they do not see the human cost. They do not see the morale of allies. They simply see numbers on a data slate. They see terms such as defeat or success. In their eyes, nothing else matters other than the final result. Briefly, circling back around, where other planets would produce ore or munitions or agri-products, Krieg produces the Death Korps and nothing else. It produces soldiers, endless new regiments for the Imperium to send to the most hellish environments, on war zones imaginable for the Imperium. The considerably suspicious part about this was the fact that although Krieg had seemed enthusiastic to contribute on its return to the Imperium, with the obvious assumption that its contribution of soldiers was in part to serve its penance for past problems, but then, more surprisingly, this rate of contribution continued. How were they able to suddenly churn out masses upon masses of endless new soldiers, especially considering how damaged the planet had been as a result of its 500-year war? So an inspection by the Mechanicus biologist team points to something that those upon Krieg had been keeping fairly quiet about, namely because it was very much considered abhorrent in many ways by the Mechanicus. So obviously, as we noted earlier, they found that upon Krieg, in past centuries, the Loyalists had begun the use of these retape wombs. Now again, as we said before, details sparse, but seemingly the power of the Death Korps of Krieg, and how successful they are in all combat deployments, led the Imperium and Mechanicus to effectively turn a blind eye to just how they're produced, which seems both comical and a stinging jab at the legacy of Colonel Jurten. This is only confirmed by the fact that when they came back under the rule of the Imperium, this process was knowingly exploited by the High Lords of Terror, because the extreme effectiveness of the Death Korps trumped really any other concerns. Their ability to just hammer out vast numbers of Krieg soldiers, LED them to being slapped with this maximum tithe level, whereby Krieg would contribute the highest levels of physical manpower to the Imperium. They existed now purely to produce the Death Korps of Krieg, and nothing else. So Krieg is a world in society already walks on the wrong side of the line when it comes to ethics, and so it's speculated they inevitably also dabble in things like abhorrent eugenic policies, all out of sight and out of mind deep in their underground cities, which farm out new humans as factories turn out new rifles. More troubling, though, is the fact that the actual nature of water vitae womb feels like the most concerning aspect here, not least because it remains deliberately vague, and within the world of 40K, things that are not described clearly are very probably the things that you really want to be worrying about. So vitae womb could be anything from a part organic cybernetic birth chamber to some far more horrifying scenario where they use actual wounds harvested and then somehow incorporated into a mechanical device to enable ongoing battery farm birthing. And yes, of course, the many other more edgy scenarios as well. And one of those more edges scenarios that someone could speculate upon would be that perhaps vitae wombs are female servitors, lobotomized human-machine hybrids, used as birthing machines for newborn Death Korps soldiers. The Mechanicus we know look upon humans as they look upon machines. There are descriptions in some of the Warhammer crime series of conservator production. How they're actually made, pretty horrific. It's definitely up there. So the mechanicals are undoubtedly very uncaring, certainly with no real sense of human morality. It would not be out of the realm of possibility for one as ruthless as Archmagos Grill, and then, as with all servitors, just used until they're no longer functional, and then sent on for organic recycling. It's very harrowing, disturbing, but unfortunately all too reasonable possibilities for the nightmarish world of 40K, my own personal view. And please take note, this is all entirely, again, my own speculation, because so little is given to us about the vitae wombs. To me, the process is more viperous. It doesn't require human hosts or anything like this that are traumatically forced into some Indus birthing thing. Because for one, that's really only a step away from Daemonculaba. And two, it seems a little much even for the horror of the Imperium. But still, you never know. Now, I would speculate that the Krieg citizenry are mandatorily assessed as to the stability of their own genetics within the unstable, irradiated conditions of living on Krieg. If they are stable, then they're considered a valid donor for source material, which is then harvested. Maybe they get some extra credits per month or something like that. And then Mechanicus texts will artificially make embryos, which are then further manipulated or screened before being implanted into the vitae wombs, which are then further altered by whatever process makes them into these near-enough clones. The actual growth and birth process are envisages. Period. Again, It must happen quite rapidly and more akin to the way the shark family reproduces, whereby individuals are grown by these exterior egg sacs, and it's this that will be constructed from womb-like organic material, like a big shark egg sac, but for a human, hundreds of individuals strung up like a meat processing factory, injected and monitored for abnormality. Any flaws or weaknesses lead to them being, of course, instantly flushed and reprocessed for their organic matter. Once they reach a state of full growth, they're unceremoniously dumped out onto a cold, metallic floor with drainage to allow the amniotic fluid to drain away. Servitors would drag these shivering newborn humanoids, of likely, say, a late teenage age. Maybe they arrive already kick-started with some learning and information false memories, some framework like this built into them to allow them to still engage and behave like humans, to a degree probably akin to replicants from Blade Runner. Or maybe they go through a further process of condensed intensive learning. They would only be partially conscious in these sort of first 24 hours. Later, they awaken, vast hive dormitories, not really understanding how they arrive there, only knowing their purpose. The general order of things. The indoctrination already teaches them that to question such things is irrelevant and punishable. All of this before the general Krieg ideology and distinct lack of concern for physical losses begins to be pounded into their minds on a daily basis. Still, whatever the reality, the critical aspect is that this happens on an industrial scale, and no matter the process and means of achieving the material vitae, wombs suddenly sit at the kids' football, lower to sump level of the ethical and moral scale. Such things are not something many are greatly troubled by in the 41st millennium. Either way, vitae wounds are not apparently a commonplace reality for the Imperium. In fact, they're seemingly the exception, not the standard, thankfully. The modern Death Korps of Krieg in M41 have maintained much of that outlook and doctrine from the centuries previous, when they fought through their bitter civil war. Its combat doctrine and cult of individual sacrifice are taught as being integral to the effectiveness and superior power of their regiments. In the mix days of the brutal Civil War, the Death Korps simply could not afford to support those weaker individuals who fell behind. And so, the nature of the Death Korps is unforgiving. It places emphasis on cooperation, but not support among the individual. Their primary approach continues to be, unsurprisingly, to deluge an enemy with overwhelming, unrelenting force, no matter the casualties. Their doctrine dictates that any battle where they have the capacity to fight and their willingness to die exceeds that of their enemy is a battle which is effectively a win by default. Any actions in between are just a means to an end. Time and material attrition, not dissimilarly to the Astartes. The Imperial Guard will use specific training practices for regiments, and the Death Korps are of course no exception. And surprisingly, they are somewhat more extreme than others in how this is implemented. From as soon as they're able to, those young members of the Death Korps are tested extensively, and even at this point, failure and even fatalities are high. What happens to the failures? Unknown. Penal legions, industrial servitude, servitors, or even perhaps again, biological recycling back into the production of new Death Korps soldiers. It's all possible, as with so very much training within the Imperium. It's your standard fare of mental and physical endurance, breaking them down in every way possible, seeing who can survive, survival upon Krieg itself, even below the surface, is no small thing. But for those who advance to the final stage of their training, this is where those remain will either become Death Korps or die. The recruits are sent out upon their most harrowing test. Again, of all survival, on, STEM, the surface of Krieg, under the supervision of senior Krieg officers. This surface of Krieg continues to remain this nightmarish landscape of apocalypse. Even centuries past the end of the Civil War, upon the world there was never any need to reclaim or repair it. So there it now stands, the annihilated scars of the world, whose very name is war. And into this hellscape walked the new recruits for the Death Korps. They will spend many months out here, marching around the trenches and across the wastelands. In freezing conditions they'll walk through heavily irradiated zones and endure fallout storms. They're made to navigate the massive wreckage of ancient war machines, dig out old trenches in the freezing conditions, clear extremely dangerous minefields, and even fight out mock but live fire battles against other Krieg recruits, where casualties, even fatal, will be taken. Only those who survive will be assigned to serve the greater good, far across the galaxy in the most handish battles imaginable, to serve the Emperor and all planets of the Imperium as members of the legendary Death Korps of Krieg.
Thank you for walking through the ashes of war with me. If you enjoyed this tale of Warhammer 40,000, subscribe to the channel to follow the next stories from the grim dark future. Turn on the bell, for even in the darkness, there are more secrets yet to be told.